now we will actually move on, and I will stop talking about the laws.
Well, we'll stop talking about laws and start talking a little bit about something equally scary, which is figuring out how exactly your operational model is going to work in Access. I think it's really important to start here we've said it multiple times, but it's worth underscoring it again, that the way the financial model of Access works is very different than other models, reimbursement models out there. And that means when you think about how you're administering your clinical program, you're going to be having to do certain things that are a little different than what have been done in the past. And the really important place that I think is necessary to start is around your customer or really patient acquisition strategy, because there are different pathways that you can take to get patients aligned with your program. But there's important things that you really need to take into account given the payment model. So typically, when we think about digital health, usually we in a very crude fashion, think about a direct to consumer type model or a business to business type model. So in the context of Access, Medicare is allowing direct outreach to Medicare beneficiaries. So an Access participant can market directly to Medicare beneficiaries and say, hey, do you have low back pain? We have this solution for you. You align with our musculoskeletal tract access program. And by the way, when you sign up, the way the program works is we only get paid if we deliver results. Sounds like a pretty compelling marketing pitch to potential patients, but also keep in mind that Access applies to your traditional Medicare population. And beyond that, there are certain exclusion criteria that exclude certain patients from this. So you're really looking at folks that are between the age of 65 and 81 that are participating in Medicare. So very specific type of direct to consumer type pipeline. What I think is going to be more impactful, given the demographic profile of the folks in this population, is more of a business to business type model, where you as an Access participant have partnered with primary care practices and other organizations that are responsible for providing care to Medicare beneficiaries. So maybe even specialty groups, physical therapy businesses, if you're MSK, psychiatry practices, if you're focused in behavioral health, where there are certain types of patients that those practices they can perform services for, but they're not necessarily well equipped to address the chronic needs that are associated with the conditions that are targeted within the Access model. And so the strategy for going out and aligning those clinicians with your Access solution is going to look very different. You're there to solve specific problems and to do so in a way that's not going to increase the burden of their clinical workload. And that is something that is really important to hammer home if you want to partner with clinicians. Is okay, it might be great. We might come up with this wonderful kind of revenue sharing solution that's of course completely legally compliant. But if we do that, how do I know that by doing that, I'm not going to have an extra 2 hours of work per week that I have to deal with because I've all of a sudden decided to partner with you? So that's going to be an important part of your customer acquisition strategy as an Access participant. It's also worth noting that there are ACO and other types of convener organizations out there that cater to traditional Medicare patients through the Medicare Shared Savings Program, and how you approach those organizations is going to look different as well, because a lot of those entities might have robust, sophisticated technological capabilities, but maybe aren't necessarily geared towards a very specific clinical chronic condition model. And so how you market to those organizations is going to be very important. There are compliance pitfalls, as I mentioned, as you look to partner on a B2B model with these organizations. If you're looking at any sort of exchange of funds, you're going to want to make sure that they're vetted to, and that they adhere to the safe harbors and exceptions related to the anti-kickback statute and Stark law. So once we've gotten to the point of getting patients aligned with your model, it's then really important that you as an organization are performing a risk assessment of these patients and vetting these patients. And what do we mean by this? Well, because the payment model is based on the outcomes that you deliver, you want to make sure that you're enrolling into your solution the right types of patients that you're likely to make have a meaningfully clinical impact on. And so the old mentality of, well, we want to take as many patients onto our solution as possible because we're in some sort of PMPM model, and the more beneficiaries we have, the more revenue we make. And yeah, there are going to be some patients that we're going to lose on because utilization is going to exceed the standard, but we'll make up for it by the fact that we're getting this PMPM stream for lower utilizers or folks that are good utilizers of our technology. that is going to look completely different. And you could say the same thing about if you're billing on a fee for service basis. Let's get the beneficiaries, let's drop our RPM and RTM codes. As long as we meet the criteria for billing, we're good to go. That's not how this model is going to work. You don't want to get every single patient possible signed up into your model. And this is something that looks very different than what you hear about from typical digital health that's typically investor backed, where the goal is to try to scale up the population as much as possible. Here, it's about attracting the right patient population. But of course, that comes with an important caveat to it, which is that if you're doing some sort of upfront risk assessment to gauge if the patient is a right fit for your model, you're going to need to make sure that you have some mechanism for offloading of that patient if they're not really aligned with your model. Because if you think about it from a consumer satisfaction standpoint, if I sign up for a solution that I think is going to cure my back pain, and that solution comes back and then tells me, sorry, we can't do that, that's not going to be a very positive consumer experience. And so you're going to need to have some sort of mechanism as an access participant when you're doing that risk assessment to figure out, how do we get this patient back maybe to that PT practice that initially referred them to us? And how do we make it look like it's a seamless kind of consumer experience where it's not, we're pushing you away because you're not a good fit for us, but more, let's find some ways to do what has been done historically a little bit differently to make sure that you are receiving the care that you need. You also need to make sure that you're assessing when you see that patient initially that they meet the inclusion criteria or that they don't hit any of the clinical exclusion criteria. Because if they don't meet those criteria, you don't get paid. You might be doing all the treatment for that patient. You might think that, I've done the work, let me see the revenue, but that's not how it works. If you don't hit the inclusion or you hit exclusion criteria, then they're not eligible to receive payment for. And so you are at risk in that regard. You also have to make sure that this is a patient for which you can demonstrate that improvement is being achieved. And so if this patient, for example, requires significant caregiver assistance in order to document things like patient-reported outcome measures, you have to make sure that you either have a process in place to do that or that you move the patient elsewhere. And so let's talk a little bit about that patient offboarding process. We mentioned the consumer concerns about having kind of a seamless integrated process, making sure that you're not, the patient doesn't feel like they're being dumped. If you take on a patient, you are taking on the risk of that patient. And so having in process risk mitigation strategies, for example, if you're noticing that a patient isn't really engaged with your solution, proactively going out and making sure that you can reestablish communications with that patient is going to be important. I personally really think it's important for organizations to have affiliations with clinical organizations in order to offboard patients if they aren't a good mix after doing that initial risk assessment. So if you are in a clinical track that's focused on, say, for example, behavioral health, having relationships with existing psychiatry practices that can provide traditional psychiatric care, if that patient isn't a good candidate for your access model, is going to be very important. And Kaitlyn, I know you, in discussing this patient offboarding process, you raised a good point to me as we were preparing here about patient abandonment rules. So wonder if you wouldn't mind kind of commenting on that.
Yes, yeah. And I was just looking at, I have another question for you actually about part one of this, the ACO track. So I'll ask you that in a second, but yes, so patient abandonment rules, just, something to think about. There are, no matter what payment model you are participating in, you will almost never be able to avoid state laws that govern, you as a provider, or if you're a digital health company, your customers and their responsibility to not abandon patients. So what you can't do, right, is just say, oh, this patient wasn't compliant or isn't a good candidate for this, so we're just going to sort of leave you to figure it out on your own. If there is a patient that you are already treating that is not a good fit for the program, you have to either continue to treat them outside of the access program or direct them to an appropriate setting of care where they can get the care that they need. Whoever you send them to can address whatever makes them not a good fit for your access program. And the same is true for ongoing treatment of patients. So if you have a patient that, you do bring in and they do seem like a good fit for access, and they become an aligned patient under your access program, but later on they're not, engaging in the way that they're supposed to, or for whatever reason they're not achieving the goals that you need them to achieve, then again, you cannot just remove them from the program and send them out on their own to figure it out. You have to give them appropriate notice. You have to follow the appropriate steps to let them know, hey, we don't think you're a good fit for this program. Here's why. Here's where we think you should go next. And we'll do a warm handoff. We'll transfer your records if you need us to. We'll make sure that you have continuity of care so that you don't, experience any gaps as a result of this decision. So yeah, that's a big one. Again, it's just important to remember that regardless of what payment model you're in or what incentives are in place, you cannot just avoid other areas of law and regulation that are going to apply to you, such as state abandonment rules. And then I'll let you sort of continue where you were, but just want to remind you, I want to go back to a question I have about the ACO and convener pathway as well before we move on to the next part of this discussion.
Yeah, no, let's cover that, Kaitlyn, because I covered what we had on the slide.
Perfect. Okay. So question that I have, thought that I have, and if you saw me looking at my phone while you were talking, it's because I was trying to figure out the answer to this and I couldn't. So one concern that I have about digital health companies, access participants, targeting ACOs as a particular referral source is leakage. So without getting into too much detail, one problem that ACOs continue to face is this concept of leakage, which is basically if they have a patient that goes out and gets primary care services or, services that the ACO is supposed to provide from a provider that is not a part of the ACO can actually get penalized for that. And what I don't know yet is whether access payments, these OAPs, are going to be considered primary care or spend outside of the ACO's payment that would constitute leakage and therefore result in the ACO getting penalized for sending someone to an access participant. Yeah. Do you know whether CMS addressed that in the RFA explicitly? I didn't see it, but I may have missed it, or they may just not have addressed it explicitly yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe that the payments related to OIPs would fall within the total cost of care bucket that an ACO would be held accountable for. That said, because these are specialty focused clinical tracks, you're not going to run into an issue where you lose attribution of the patient because they're receiving care from an access participant. So basically, the way to think about it when in approaching an ACO, if you're an access participant, is do you have out of control spending related to these chronic conditions that your existing specialty partners have not been able to help you solve? If yes, then we are a good partner because we can help manage those costs. Yes, the outcome adjusted payments that we're receiving as part of these services are going to be considered as part of utilization, but presumably, we're going to be saving you more than if you were sending that patient to the poor performing pain medicine practice that does not have a PT solution and immediately goes to injectables and is driving cost per patient up really high. So that's a great question. And my recollection from the RFA is that the OIPs are considered part of total cost of care, but that it doesn't result in any sort of, that patient then is no longer attributed to the ACO.
Okay, got it. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. And maybe as a sort of longer term strategy, you sort of think about actually just like fully partnering with ACOs so that it doesn't necessarily hurt their overall cost of care, or they're not, concerned about referring patients to you, which maybe they won't be if you can demonstrate that you can save them money. But it's a good thing to think about when you think about like, what data are you collecting? What value can you offer to ACOs, conveners, or whoever you're going to encourage them to refer patients to you? Maybe you start looking at your data now and say, well, here's where we think we can move the needle for you immediately. And then over time, here's what we'll work on together to start to, to move that needle even further.
Yeah. I think it's a great point.
Awesome. All right. So next slide then.
Yes. So let's talk then a little bit about post-enrollment approaches for patients. So we've broken this down into kind of 4 really important buckets when it comes to, okay, I've got a patient aligned with access. What do I need to ensure that I've really got down pat to make sure that we've got success with these patients in this program? And there's four places that we think is really important to focus on. The first, and we talked a little bit about this in our first presentation, is focusing on building the tech, or focusing on already having the tech infrastructure and capabilities that are necessary as part of this model. So you have to have APIs, you have to have the ability to communicate with EHRs through FHIR compatible systems. You have to have communication capabilities with health insurance exchanges. You have to be able to have communications with PCPs. So APIs, EHRs, HIEs, PCPs, and you have to communicate with Medicare, CMS, tons of acronyms, but getting down the information transfer streams is going to be very important here, because a big emphasis with Medicare on this access program is transparency. Everybody having visibility into what's going on with the patient. Is there success? And ultimately, at the end of the day, how you perform is going to be reported publicly by Medicare. So the tech infrastructure necessary for reporting is important. And then comes the actual reporting processes itself within the organization. Internally, how are you capturing the data that you need to be reporting to the various stakeholders here? We talked a little bit about in the first section, or in the first session prior to this one, about some of the communication standards that exist with PCPs. How are you ensuring that you're getting in touch with PCPs within 10 days after a care escalation issues happen? How are you documenting this so that it reaches the EHR of the PCP? How are you reporting on the various outcome measures to Medicare? Setting a clear process for doing this ahead of time is going to be absolutely essential, because ultimately your payment is tied to the outcomes you deliver. And so if you want to ensure that you're hitting those outcomes, having these processes clearly outlined ahead of time is going to be very important. You really do also have to recognize that what you do is going to be visible publicly. So if I have an access participant and I am not hitting the clinical biomarker, the meaningfully clinical improvement thresholds or the clinical control thresholds, that's going to be something that's going to be public. And so going into the model, being clear that you have the pathways to achieve this, and that, as we talked about in the prior slide, you've done the work to make sure you're picking up the patients that you know you're going to be able to succeed with this in, is going to be very, very important. You also want to focus on communication with patients. And so we have two little boxes in the bottom here that where this comes important. So talking about optimizing outcomes to prevent churn. So how do we do that? We've got patients that need to be engaged, because if they're not engaged, then they're going to have to be disenrolled as part of this process. And so you can essentially write that care off as a loss for your organization, because you're not going to see payment related to it. So how are you ensuring that you have robust communication with patients, robust engagement with patients? That can be a scary thing, but the exciting thing about Access is you don't have all these prescriptive rules around the fact that, look, you needed to have communication with the patient at least once monthly, and a care manager had to spend 20 minutes with that patient. You no longer have those really strict rules around that's what needs to be done to drop the code on a fee-for-service world. You can really leverage AI tools to achieve that patient engagement. You can leverage machine learning to motivate patients and to be dynamic about that, and to profile patients and to say, hey, this patient is motivated by daily reminders, or this patient is motivated by a voice message that says that's uplifting, or this patient is motivated by tough love. These are things that you can integrate into your solution because you have that flexibility as part of Access. But that engagement is going to be crucial when it comes to being able to deliver on success with these measures, because that's where, in talking to commercial payers, where they've seen these programs really falter is the patient signs up, they're excited the first 2 days, and then it's gone from there. So optimizing those outcomes to prevent churn is that first bucket. And then really standardizing your care escalation pathways is going to be essential here. beyond the communication with the patient, what does the communication look like with their underlying clinical care team? How are you making sure that that patient's PCP is up to date with how this patient is doing? Remember, the PCPs are going to be eligible for co-management payments, so they do have a bit of a financial incentive to be receiving and reviewing that information. But how are you providing that information to the PC in a way that's meaningful and doesn't overwhelm them? And so it just goes in one ear and out the other, so to speak, or in one eyeball out the other if they're looking at it through an EHR. And then we talked a little bit about pre-enrollment, but if you identify midstream that a patient isn't really working within this model, how are you offloading that patient in a way that's doing right by the patient, recognizing that you may not necessarily be no longer eligible for the outcome aligned payments associated with that patient. So these post-enrollment operational capabilities, really important to pin down before you go into this model, and look different than they typically have in the past for organizations, given the way that these payment structures have worked. It's been historically in fee-for-service all about, do I check the boxes? Okay, I've checked the boxes. I move on. I don't really care anymore. This is totally different. You're kind of working backwards. I want to deliver these great outcomes. How do I build the operational process to make sure that we get to that end state and reason backwards from there?
As you were talking, I was thinking about like remote monitoring companies and chronic care management companies and my clients who, we have these conversations all the time. Like, okay, patients don't like it when we call them once a month. They don't want to talk to us on the phone if they don't, if there's no reason to, if their data looks normal and we don't need to make a change or ask them any questions. This sort of lets you do that. It lets you really sort of cater to what the patient actually wants and what actually helps them be successful without, checking those boxes. The other thing I was thinking about is a lot of my clients in the care management space, we all got pretty excited about APCM when the APCM codes were first created because they weren't time-based and they were, they allowed providers to just sort of not have to track time, not have to check those boxes and just bill a flat fee each month. However, the amount of reimbursement for those APCM codes was pretty small. And so for my care management companies that were really focused on RPM or one particular type of condition, it didn't always make sense for them to try to, facilitate an APCM program because they would have to expand their functionality and support a bunch of functions that they don't already support by, expanding their products, expanding their tools, expanding their services, all for a very, very thin margin for the provider. So it didn't really make sense. But interestingly here, I think those very specific tools, for example, a remote monitoring tool, could stick to RPM and still be very successful and very valuable for an access participant because they've built out, for example, that engagement workflow and they've got it really streamlined and it's, it's already really efficient and it already sort of takes into account what needs to happen versus what the patient actually wants to happen. And without having to expand and support all of those other functions that they don't already support, because there's a little bit more leeway for an access participant to say, either through the tools directory or through just general marketing channels, okay, I'm going to pick you for my RPM, I'm going to pick you for my data analytics, you for my risk stratification, without, with potentially or hopefully not so thin margins that they would have on that sort of APCM side, because the access clinical tracks are already more specific than APCM is as a program. So just an interesting thought I had as you were talking as a sort of, different way to think about this. How is it different from existing fee-for-service reimbursement mechanisms, and how can digital health companies sort of change the way they think about how they support their customers that are participating in access?
Yeah, that's excellent. I love that example. I think that's all spot on.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you for joining us and exploring the details of the Access model. We invite you to watch our other videos on the basics and paths to success in the Access model. We welcome outreach if you have any questions.